I was under a lot of pressure, as I said, living at home, defending the fact that I'd won 2 majors in 69 and 70.
Golf legends tried to explain how terrifying Lee Trevino was, but words never quite captured the nightmare he created on championship Sundays, when the pressure was at its peak and the world was watching. They called his swings impossible, techniques that defied every principle taught in pro shops and country clubs across America. They said he bent reality, that somehow he made the ball obey laws of physics nobody else could access. They watched him execute shots that shouldn't work, that violated everything they had been taught about cause and effect in golf. Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear himself, the man who dominated professional golf with robotic precision and mental toughness that seemed unbreakable, finished second to Trevino 4 times in major championships. 4 devastating times. More than to any other single rival in his magnificent career. More than Arnold Palmer, more than Tom Watson, more than Gary Player, more than anyone else who challenged his throne during golf's golden era. And still, after all those defeats, after all that film study and mental preparation and course strategy, Nicklaus couldn't crack the code that would let him beat this wisecracking outsider when championships hung in the balance. Gary Player, the disciplined monk of golf who controlled every variable in his life with military precision, who ate the right foods at the right times, and trained his body like an Olympic athlete long before fitness became standard, felt his entire game unravel the moment Trevino stepped onto the course with that infectious smile. The quiet focus Player had built his entire career on, the internal stillness that made him one of the game's all-time greats, simply evaporated in Trevino's presence. Tony Jacklin, Britain's golden boy and the pride of a nation hungry for golfing success, watched his entire career as a major championship contender collapse in the aftermath of a single chip shot. A miracle that looked casual but broke him psychologically in ways he would never fully recover from, haunting him for decades. These weren't ordinary players getting rattled by a hot streak or a lucky bounce. These were titans of the game, champions who had conquered every challenge golf threw at them, legends who controlled every variable in their mental and physical preparation except one: Lee Trevino, the man who turned golf's calmest minds into nervous wrecks. The hustler from the Texas dirt who made impossible swings look not just routine, but almost boring in their mechanical consistency. The outsider with the working-class roots who walked into the country club world and made kings feel like amateurs fumbling through their first round. Before we dive into exactly how he did it, hit that hype button below this video and give it some love. It helps us keep bringing you stories like this, the untold psychological battles that shaped the game you watch today. Now here's the question that haunted every champion who stepped into a pairing with Lee Trevino. How did a wisecracking kid from the Texas gambling circuits, a guy who learned golf from hustlers and reprobates, who played for his next meal against men carrying what he called artillery in their golf bags, completely dismantle the greatest, most prepared, most disciplined players who ever held a club? The answer isn't hiding in his swing mechanics, though those were bizarre enough to unsettle anyone. It's not buried in his scorecards, though those told their own terrifying story. The real answer is in what he did to their minds, to the very fabric of their mental frameworks. Golf in the 1960s was supposed to be quiet, refined, almost sacred in its adherence to tradition. The sport had rules, not just for how you played, but for how you behaved, how you dressed, how you carried yourself, and, most importantly, for who belonged in the elite circles and who didn't. You had Ben Hogan with his ice-cold stare, practicing until his hands bled, but doing it within the strict framework of country club tradition. Arnold Palmer with his army of devoted working-class followers, a relatable hero who still fundamentally respected the game's genteel boundaries. Jack Nicklaus with his unshakable focus, groomed from childhood to be the perfect champion. Then Lee Trevino arrived like a dust storm from West Texas, and everything the sport thought it knew about itself shifted. Born in 1939 in North Dallas, raised by his mother and grandfather in a 4-room shack that didn't have indoor plumbing, didn't have running water, didn't have anything resembling comfort or security. This wasn't the romantic kind of poverty that builds character in movies. This was raw survival, day-to-day existence with no safety net whatsoever. This was waking up each morning not knowing if you'd eat that day, if there would be work, if the roof would hold. This was a childhood where golf wasn't a pleasant weekend game or a path to college. It was a potential escape route from a life that offered virtually no other exits. Trevino didn't pick up the game at a country club with a junior program and a patient professional. He dropped out of school at age 14, not because he was rebellious, but because his family desperately needed whatever money he could earn. He started caddying at the Dallas Athletic Club, carrying bags for wealthy men, watching them play a game that looked remarkably easy when you had unlimited time and money and access to pristine facilities. He learned golf not from instructional books, but from what he later called reprobates and hustlers, men on the margins of society who saw the game purely as a hustle, as a way to separate marks from their money, men who played for stakes they couldn't afford to lose. While young Jack Nicklaus was perfecting his fundamentally sound swing under Jack Grout in comfortable Ohio, hitting thousands of balls on perfectly manicured practice ranges, Trevino was digging it out of the dirt on underground gambling circuits across Texas, playing on dusty municipal courses against men twice his age. He played matches for $10 when he only had $5 in his pocket, which meant losing wasn't just disappointing, it was potentially catastrophic. He later reflected that once you've played for your next meal against men with artillery in their golf bags, men who treated every shot like life or death, because for them it was, a putt to win the US Open feels almost insignificant by comparison. That brutal crucible forged something his privileged rivals simply never possessed. The ability to feel genuine pressure, the kind that alters your life and not just handle it but laugh at it, refuse to give it power, to stand over a critical putt knowing you might not eat if you miss, and still make a smooth stroke. Trevino learned that pressure is only terrifying if you think you have something to lose. When you've already lost everything, pressure becomes liberating. Number 9 on the list of players who couldn't solve the Lee Trevino puzzle was Chichi Rodriguez, a man who understood Trevino from a cultural and socioeconomic perspective the country club elite simply couldn't access. For Chichi, Trevino wasn't just another talented competitor to beat on Sunday or a dangerous rival to study. He was a trailblazer, a pioneer who kicked down doors that had been locked to players who looked like them, talked like them, came from where they came from. Rodriguez watched Trevino's rise with a complicated mixture of immense pride and genuine terror. He saw how Trevino turned psychological warfare into something more dangerous and effective than any technical swing advantage. Chichi once said Lee Trevino is the most dangerous man in golf when he's on, and then added the crucial detail that explained everything. He's so dangerous because you never know what he's going to do next. That unpredictability wasn't random chaos or lack of discipline. It was calculated, strategic, purposeful. Trevino understood something fundamental about competitive psychology. If your opponent can't predict your next move, they can't prepare an effective defense against it. They're always reacting instead of acting, always half a step behind, always uncomfortable and off balance. For Rodriguez, Trevino's success carried enormous personal meaning that transcended mere golf scores. It meant the PGA Tour, that bastion of country club exclusivity, could no longer ignore or marginalize working-class players who didn't fit the traditional mold. Trevino opened doors simply by being unapologetically himself, by refusing to apologize for his background. But that pride came with an undercurrent of fear because Chichi understood the implications. If Trevino could do what he did to legends like Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer, to the game's most mentally tough champions, what could he potentially do to everyone else? Number 8 was Arnold Palmer, the people's champion, the king, the man whose army of devoted followers made him the most beloved and culturally powerful figure in golf history. Palmer built his entire legacy on charisma, on an almost magical ability to connect with blue-collar fans who saw themselves reflected in his aggressive, fearless, go-for-broke style of play. He was the working-class hero who made it big, but never forgot where he came from. Then Trevino showed up on tour with the same working-class roots Palmer had leveraged so effectively, the same natural charisma that made people want to follow him, but with even more raw accessibility and unfiltered personality. Suddenly, slowly but inexorably, Palmer's army started to shift its allegiance. The documentary Beyond Golf captured this cultural earthquake in one devastating sentence. Arnold Palmer watched his army desert him. Trevino didn't just beat Palmer on scoreboards in head-to-head competitions. He outflanked him culturally, appealing to exactly the same demographic Palmer had owned and defined himself by for over a decade. For Palmer, whose entire identity was tied to being the beloved leader of the masses, Trevino's rise felt like a quiet but devastating betrayal. The people who had worshipped Palmer were now cheering louder for the new kid. Even decades later, the uncomfortable dynamic lingered. In 2006, Trevino found himself paired with Palmer for what would become Palmer's final competitive round ever played. On a short par 3, Palmer hit his tee shot and immediately asked Trevino, "How close is that?" Trevino had to deliver the brutal truth. The ball had hit the bank short of the green and rolled backwards into the water. Even worse, Palmer had been aiming at a tree on the hillside, not the actual flag. Palmer, confronted with this evidence of decline he could no longer deny, simply quit on that hole and ended his competitive career right there without finishing. Trevino wasn't trying to humiliate the king, he was just being honest. But the symbolism was unbearably poignant. The king's final moment was a failure witnessed by the very man who had displaced him. Number 7 was Tom Weiskopf, a player who believed with almost religious fervor in the purity and beauty of the golf swing as an ideal. Weiskopf possessed what many experts considered the most beautiful, technically perfect swing in the entire world. A motion so fluid it looked like ballet. Then he had to watch Lee Trevino win major championship after major championship, using what looked like all the wrong moves. Trevino's setup was bizarre. He stood far too far from the ball, farther than any instructor would recommend. His stance was extremely open. His feet aimed well left of target. His grip was considered weak. This combination should, according to every instructional book, produce a massive, uncontrollable slice. Yet somehow Trevino hit controlled, repeatable fades that held their line perfectly in any wind condition. He scrambled, he joked constantly, he used unorthodox angles, and he kept winning the tournaments that mattered most. For Weisskopf, this was a profound philosophical crisis. His entire belief system said that beautiful, technically sound swings produce consistently great golf. Trevino represented everything Weisskopf's intellectual framework argued should not work. The scrambling, the joking, the ugly fades, all of it violated the natural order. Yet Trevino kept proving the system wrong. This challenged Weisskopf's entire framework, made him question everything he thought he knew. Trevino became a wrong-way winner who destroyed the confidence of those who prioritized beauty over results. Every time Trevino hoisted another trophy, it felt to Weisskopf like a personal attack. Number 6 was Tom Watson, a player known throughout the golf world for possessing mental toughness that genuinely rivaled Nicklaus himself. Watson operated within a carefully controlled, quiet psychological framework, systematically shutting out all distractions and focusing entirely on execution. Nothing rattled him, nothing except Lee Trevino. Watson later cited Trevino as one of the single most difficult opponents he ever faced in his entire career, and crucially, it wasn't because of superior shot making. It was because of Trevino's presence, his energy, his refusal to let the round settle into the quiet rhythm Watson needed. Trevino never stopped talking during a competitive round, never. He joked constantly with fans lining the fairways. He maintained running commentary with his caddy about everything and nothing. He even engaged his playing partners in casual mid-round conversation. For Watson, who desperately needed silence to access his best golf, Trevino's relentless energy was like radio static, jamming the clear signal Watson relied on. The harder Watson tried to focus, to block out the noise and return to his quiet mental space, the more Trevino's constant chatter seemed to pull him out of his own head. Golf Channel archival footage captured Watson's deference toward Trevino, showing the almost fearful respect Watson expressed when discussing Trevino's intimidating precision. This was the Watson paradox. A player universally famous for mental strength, completely undone by an opponent who simply refused to take the game as seriously as everyone else thought it should be taken. Trevino didn't need to be intimidating in the traditional sense. He just needed to be fully human in a game that demanded robotic focus. By being authentically himself, loud and loose and relentless, he exposed the fragility of artificial concentration. Watson could handle any amount of external pressure. He had no defense against Trevino. Number 5 was Johnny Miller, perhaps the most analytically sharp and technically sophisticated golfer of the entire 1970s generation. Miller approached the game like an engineer, breaking down every component of ball flight. He described Trevino's ball flight, his shot shape and trajectory patterns, as almost inhuman in their mechanical consistency. Most elite players of that era, following prevailing wisdom about maximizing distance, sought to hit a high draw, a shot that starts right of target and curves gently left. Trevino built his entire game around the exact opposite shot shape. He hit a low, holding fade, a ball flight that started left of target and curved gently right, landing softer. More importantly, he could repeat this exact shot with almost machine-like precision, regardless of wind conditions, regardless of pressure, regardless of circumstance. Miller once said, and this quote is revealing, "Trevino, myself, you'll see some guys bowing down to the shot." He was referring specifically to the way Trevino controlled his lead wrist position through the critical impact zone, maintaining a distinctly bowed forward position, very similar to what modern players like Dustin Johnson later became famous for using. This particular wrist position minimized face angle variation at the moment when club meets ball. It allowed Trevino to hit what he described as dead straight fades that landed like a soft butterfly with sore feet. Everything about Trevino's setup looked fundamentally wrong to anyone schooled in traditional instruction. He stood too far from the ball, a position that creates compensation problems. His grip was too weak, lacking the strong position teachers advocated. Every instructor would predict disaster. But Trevino had developed a move, a transition he borrowed and adapted from Ben Hogan himself that made the whole system work. He dropped his lead heel and rotated his hips violently, explosively through the ball, generating enormous rotational speed. This hip rotation squared the club face at precisely the right moment, producing a flat, penetrating, wind-proof strike that repeated like clockwork. For Johnny Miller, watching Trevino was like watching someone break fundamental laws of instruction and still produce consistently elite results. It didn't make logical sense, but it worked, undeniably, repeatedly, devastatingly, and that made it terrifying. Number 4 was Gary Player, a man whose existence was built on discipline, focus, and monkish devotion to preparation. Player approached golf with systematic precision, controlling every controllable variable. He ate the right foods, trained his body like an Olympic athlete, decades before fitness became standard. He meditated, visualized, prepared his mind as carefully as his muscles. Then he'd play with Trevino and watch his system collapse. Trevino carried what Player described as a kind of electricity, a rhythm that didn't match anyone else's. Player famously stated, "If Billy Casper unsettled me with oppressive silence, then Lee Trevino unsettled me with constant disruption." Casper's quiet personality created uncomfortable silence. Trevino's energy created chaotic noise, different tactics, identical results. Trevino never allowed a round to breathe, to settle into the meditative rhythm Player needed. He was constant motion, talking to fans, chatting with his caddy. For Player, Trevino's energy was like interference jamming his frequency. Player described playing with Trevino as feeling like the course had shifted into Trevino's tempo. You either kept up with his pace or fell behind and lost rhythm. Player could never find a defense. This was simply Trevino's natural state, forged in loud Texas gambling dens where silence meant weakness. By being himself, Trevino became walking sabotage. It was the perfect weapon because it wasn't a weapon at all. Before we get to the top 3 players on this countdown, we need to talk about the summer of 1971, a 3-week stretch of dominance that cemented Trevino's reputation as golf's single most terrifying and dangerous competitor. In just 21 days, Trevino won 3 of the biggest, most prestigious tournaments in world golf, an achievement that has never been matched and likely never will be. First came the U.S. Open on June 21st at historic Marion Golf Club, where after 72 regulation holes, Trevino stood tied with Jack Nicklaus himself, forcing an 18-hole playoff the next day. Trevino shot .280 for the week, then demolished Nicklaus in the playoff with a brilliant 68. Then, barely 2 weeks later, came the Canadian Open on July 4th, where Trevino shot .275 and won in yet another playoff. Finally, just 6 days after that came the Open Championship, the oldest tournament in golf, played on July 10th at Royal Birkdale. Trevino shot .278 to claim the Claret Jug, becoming the only player in the entire history of professional golf to win the U.S. Open, Canadian Open, and Open Championship in a single season. This wasn't a lucky hot streak or a few fortunate bounces. This was terrifying, relentless, mechanical consistency. 3 dramatically different golf courses on 3 different continents, requiring completely different strategies. 3 different fields of the world's best players, all trying desperately to stop him. 3 victories in just 3 weeks. While his rivals struggled to maintain peak form for even 1 week, burning out after a single major, Trevino somehow kept accelerating, kept finding another gear. That summer proved conclusively what they all feared deep down. When Lee Trevino got hot, he didn't cool down. He just kept winning. Number 3 on the countdown was Tony Jacklin, the reigning hero of British golf, a national treasure who carried the hopes of an entire country on his shoulders every time he teed it up. The 1972 Open Championship at Muirfield was supposed to be Jacklin's coronation, his moment to cement legendary status in front of adoring home fans who had waited so long for a British champion. He and Trevino reached the final round, locked in a compelling head-to-head duel for the Claret Jug, trading brilliant shots and momentum shifts. By the time they walked onto the 17th tee in the fading Scottish afternoon light, they were dead even, tied for the lead with just 2 precious holes remaining between them and immortality. What happened next destroyed Jacklin psychologically and fundamentally altered the trajectory of his entire career in ways he could never have imagined. Trevino played the par 5 17th hole absolutely disastrously from the very start. His drive found a greenside bunker, a terrible miss that left him scrambling. He hacked his way awkwardly down the fairway, each shot worse than the last, the ball refusing to cooperate. By the time he finally reached the back fringe of the green, he was lying 4, having taken twice as many shots as a tour professional should ever need on a reachable par 5. Jacklin, meanwhile, had played the hole exactly as designed by the architect, positioning himself on the putting surface in regulation, lying 3 and facing a very reasonable birdie putt that would almost certainly give him a commanding 2-stroke lead with just 1 hole remaining. From Jacklin's perspective, standing over that birdie attempt, the championship was essentially over, the Claret Jug already his. Trevino had made a catastrophic mistake, and Jacklin had capitalized perfectly. Trevino later admitted in interviews that he had mentally given up on the 17th hole entirely. He was just trying to finish the hole without further embarrassment so he could somehow salvage a miracle on 18. He stepped up to his ball, sitting in the rough behind the green, barely glanced at the line and hit a casual, almost indifferent chip shot with seemingly no expectation of a positive result. The ball rolled smoothly across the fringe, tracked perfectly toward the cup, and dropped into the hole for an improbable par. Peter Alliss, calling the moment for the BBC, perfectly captured the significance. That last deadly miracle of Trevino's has broken Jacklin. I'm sure we will never see another Open like this. Jacklin, suddenly confronted with this reality-altering development, proceeded to three-putt the 17th green for bogey, when par had seemed automatic moments before. Then he bogeyed 18 as well. Trevino parred the final hole to win the championship by a single stroke. Beyond the immediate result, the chip destroyed something fundamental in Jacklin's competitive psychology. He later admitted that the psychological blow was something he never fully recovered from, that it marked the beginning of his decline as a legitimate major championship contender. For Jacklin, the lesson was devastating. You can do everything right, make all the correct decisions, execute your game plan perfectly, and still lose because your opponent makes a miracle shot. It shattered his belief in control. That single moment haunted Jacklin for the rest of his career. It made Trevino seem almost supernatural. Number 2 is Raymond Floyd, an established star and future Hall of Famer who learned about Lee Trevino's unique brand of terror the hard way in a private money match that became legendary. This happened in the early 1960s, before Trevino had gained his tour card, when he was still an unknown hustler. A wealthy cotton producer named Martin Letnich arranged a 54-hole money match at Horizon Hills Country Club in El Paso, backing Trevino heavily against Floyd. Floyd pulled up to the club in his gleaming white Cadillac, full of confidence. When he walked into the clubhouse, he was greeted by Trevino, who wasn't introduced as his opponent, but was working his regular job as a bag boy and locker room attendant. Trevino cleaned Floyd's golf shoes with careful attention, treating him with exaggerated deference. He carried Floyd's heavy tour bag to the first tee, playing the role of humble servant perfectly. This wasn't accidental. This was the first calculated stage of a psychological hustle Trevino had perfected. When Floyd finally asked, "Who exactly am I playing against today?" and Trevino responded with perfect timing, "Well, that would be me, sir," Floyd was visibly dismissive. How could anyone bet on a bag boy? That dismissal was exactly what Trevino wanted. By dramatically lowering Floyd's guard, Trevino created a massive psychological advantage. Then the match started, and Floyd discovered the horrible truth. Day 1, Floyd shot an excellent 66, the kind of round that wins regular tour events. Trevino shot 65, one better. Day 2, Floyd matched his opening 66. Trevino responded with a stunning 64, pulling further ahead. Day 3, Floyd finally managed to win a day with 67 to Trevino's 68, but the match was already over. Trevino had won overall. Floyd's cumulative total of 199 over 54 holes was genuinely staggering golf. Yet he barely escaped with a one-stroke victory on the final day, and even that only happened because Floyd made a clutch eagle on the 54th hole. Without that eagle, Floyd loses outright. The experience left Floyd shaken. He returned to the PGA Tour and immediately began warning his colleagues. There's a little Mexican kid in El Paso. When he comes out to the tour, everyone is going to have to make room for him. This match established the Trevino blueprint. Use an unassuming exterior and constant chatter to mask precision that is, for all practical purposes, unbeatable. Trevino later said, "I loved it when a guy backed me. That's when I was dangerous because it wasn't my money. So I had no pressure and I could just play." That fearlessness made him immune to pressure that crushed his tour rivals. Before Trevino ever set foot on the PGA Tour as a professional competitor, he spent 4 transformative years serving in the United States Marine Corps from 1956 to 1960. The Marines gave Trevino something his hustler instincts lacked: structure, discipline, systematic preparation. He represented the Corps with pride in overseas golf competitions. The Marine environment reinforced his already formidable work ethic. He became known for hitting practice balls for hours without break, until his hands literally bled. But more importantly, the Marines gave Trevino a battlefield perspective on competitive golf. To Trevino, a golf course was terrain to be conquered. An opponent was a target to be neutralized. When Trevino finally got his tour card, he brought a complete framework his rivals couldn't match. He combined the street-smart cunning of a Texas hustler with the systematic discipline of a Marine. His rivals saw golf as a gentleman's game. Trevino saw it as war. That fundamental difference gave him an enormous advantage. Number 1 on the countdown, Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear, the king of professional golf, a man whose mental toughness was considered his greatest weapon. Nicklaus had faced every conceivable challenge the game could offer and defeated nearly everyone. But Trevino was something entirely different. Nicklaus later acknowledged that while he could control himself completely, he could never control his great rivals. He couldn't control Arnold Palmer, couldn't control Gary Player, couldn't control Tom Watson, and he definitely couldn't control Lee Trevino. Nicklaus singled out Trevino as his most uniquely dangerous opponent, the player who always seemed to be be there when a major championship was on the line. The statistics tell a brutal story. Nicholas finished second to Trevino in 4 major championships, more runner-up finishes to a single rival than to any other player who challenged him. 4 times Nicholas brought his absolute best, and it wasn't enough. The 1971 U.S. Open at Merion was the defining confrontation. After 72 holes, they were tied, forcing an 18-hole playoff. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Nicholas was fighting to reclaim his position. Trevino was fighting to prove his 1968 win hadn't been a fluke. On the first tee of the playoff, Trevino pulled a 3-foot-long rubber snake from his golf bag and tossed it casually toward Nicholas. Popular lore describes this as a simple prank, but the tactical value ran much deeper. Trevino was a master of vibrational control. He understood that Nicholas thrived in solemn, reverent environments where his superior focus could suffocate opponents. By pulling out a ridiculous toy snake and making the gallery erupt in laughter, by getting even Nicholas himself to crack a smile, Trevino effectively popped the bubble of championship gravity that Nicholas preferred. He shifted the emotional energy toward his preferred tempo. Nicholas, ever the perfect sportsman, asked to examine the snake up close, and he chuckled genuinely. But that chuckle signaled a critical shift. Nicholas, now operating in a loosened-up environment that favored Trevino's approach, birdied the opening hole a strong start. But then he faltered badly. On the second hole, Nicholas bunkered his approach and made bogey. On the third hole, he bunkered again, leading to double bogey. That bogey-double bogey sequence broke whatever remained of Nicholas's momentum. Trevino settled comfortably into his own tempo and never looked back, cruising to victory. Later, Nicholas spoke about Trevino with unmistakable respect. He is a good player and a very tough competitor. I really enjoyed playing against Lee. I loved him as a competitor because he knew that he was not going to beat himself when he got himself in contention and was playing well. That respect was earned through repeated defeats in the moments that defined careers. For Jack Nicklaus, the most successful major champion in history, Lee Trevino remained the one shadow he could never quite escape. So what made Lee Trevino so uniquely, devastatingly terrifying to face when a championship was on the line? The answer isn't any single factor or isolated skill. It was the synergistic combination of 3 distinct pillars that worked together in perfect harmony to systematically dismantle even the greatest players in golf history. First, the hustler's mindset forged in absolute poverty and real-world survival pressure. Trevino played for his literal next meal on underground gambling circuits, where losing meant genuine hardship, not just disappointment, but actual hunger. That brutal environment forged a pressure-proof mentality his country club-raised rivals couldn't replicate, no matter how hard they tried. When tournament stakes were at their highest, when millions watched and legacies hung in the balance, Trevino got calmer and more focused, not more nervous. While others tightened up under the crushing weight of expectation, Trevino loosened up, freed by the knowledge that he'd already survived worse. He'd already played golf when it truly mattered for survival. Professional tournaments, even majors, were just golf after that. Second, rhythmic chaos that disrupted opponents' carefully constructed mental frameworks. Trevino never let a competitive round breathe or settle into the quiet, meditative rhythm most champions desperately needed to access their best golf. His constant talking, endless joking, relentless energy disrupted players like Gary Player, who needed absolute silence to function at their peak. Tom Watson couldn't find his controlled framework when paired with Trevino's non-stop commentary. Even Jack Nicklaus, after the rubber snake incident shattered his solemn championship focus, lost his systematic rhythm and couldn't recover it. Trevino didn't just play golf and try to post the lowest score, he controlled the entire vibe and emotional atmosphere of the round itself, forcing opponents to either play at his frenetic tempo, or Johnny Miller called his ball striking almost inhuman in its consistency. Tom Weiskopf couldn't intellectually reconcile how something so technically ugly could produce such reliably elite results, tournament after tournament. When you combine these 3 powerful elements, when you synthesize them into a single complete competitor, you create someone who is very nearly impossible to beat when playing well. Someone who doesn't crack psychologically under pressure because he's already survived genuine survival pressure that made golf look trivial. Someone who disrupts your mental focus and rhythm just by being his authentic self without even trying. Someone who hits shots that shouldn't be repeatable with a swing that shouldn't work according to textbooks, but somehow does, perfectly, again and again and again. That combination of mental immunity, tactical disruption, and mechanical mystery is absolutely terrifying to face across 72 holes when a major championship is at stake. But here's the most important truth about Lee Trevino's terrifying reputation. The fear his legendary rivals felt wasn't really about intimidation. It was actually respect, the deepest form of competitive respect possible. They didn't fear Trevino because he was cruel or unfair. They feared him because he systematically exposed their carefully hidden weaknesses. He showed Jack Nicklaus that even the strongest mental toughness has exploitable limits. He showed Gary Player that perfect discipline can be disrupted. He showed Tony Tony Jacklin that sometimes your opponent just makes a miracle? He showed Tom Weiskopf that beautiful swings don't guarantee success. He showed Arnold Palmer that charisma can be outflanked. Trevino was terrifying because he fundamentally refused to play by the established rules that governed championship golf. He brought the raw hustle of Texas gambling circuits to the hallowed grounds of Marion, Muirfield, and Royal Birkdale. He proved that the most effective way to win is to make your opponent feel like they're playing a different game, one they no longer fully understand. And remarkably, he did all of this while cracking jokes and making galleries laugh. The legends feared him because when Lee Trevino was on his game, he didn't just beat you, he made you fundamentally doubt everything you thought you knew about golf. Lee Trevino's lasting legacy is a powerful reminder that greatness doesn't always look the way traditional expectations suggest. He didn't have the perfect swing, he didn't have the country club pedigree, he didn't play with stoic silence, but he had something his rivals didn't possess: the ability to make genuinely impossible swings look routine, the mental toughness to thrive under pressure that would crush ordinary players, and the authentic confidence to be unapologetically himself in a sport that demanded conformity. That's exactly why golf legends still struggle to find adequate words explaining how terrifying Lee Trevino truly was in his prime. Because he wasn't just another great player, he was a genuine force of nature who fundamentally changed professional golf by absolutely refusing to change himself to fit expectations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychological warfare and pure brilliance of Lee Trevino, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from golf history that reveal the mental battles happening between the shots. Drop a comment below telling us which legend's struggle with Trevino surprised you most. And don't forget to hit that hype button one more time to show this video some love. Lee Trevino proved conclusively that the most dangerous opponent is the one who absolutely refuses to beat himself. And in the end, that unshakable mental toughness combined with impossible swings is exactly what made Lee Trevino golf's most terrifying competitor.
The way you drive it, you're the greatest putter I've ever seen. But Jack is the greatest, still can putt the same way. The method that he has is flawless. You know, nobody's ever copied it. But Jack had the fastest left shoulder I've ever seen. What do you have when you have a fast left shoulder? Jack was a fader. Everybody thinks he drew the ball. He never did that. He faded everything.
And at that time there, Matt, when I walked off the green, Jack came over to me and he put his arm around my neck like this, tugged like this, and he looked at me. He said, "Tom, I gave you my best shot, but it wasn't good enough." And he smiled and he said, "Congratulations, I'm really happy for you." In my career, that was probably the biggest change in my career right now. When Jack said he gave me his best shot and it wasn't good enough, I said, now maybe I've arrived and I can beat and play with the big boys.
Golf legends will tell you that facing Jack Nicklaus was absolutely terrifying and that he was built different from every other player who ever picked up a club. But here is the strange part. Nicklaus never trash-talked. He never threw clubs. He never bullied anyone. He did not try to get in your head. So why did the greatest players in history describe him as the most frightening opponent they ever faced? The answer lies in something far more unsettling than anger. It was the quiet certainty that no matter how well you played, he would still be there, calm and unbothered, hunting you down. Imagine playing the best golf of your life. Every drive splits the fairway, every approach sticks close. You are in the zone. Then you look at the leaderboard. Jack Nicklaus, right behind you, not panicking, just there, waiting for you to blink. You could not shake him. You could only hope to outplay him for 72 straight holes. Almost nobody could. In 1986, at 46, the world wrote him off as washed up. He had not won a major in 6 years. The media dismissed him. When asked if he could still compete, Nicklaus responded simply, "I know I can." Then he proved it, shooting a back 930 at Augusta, winning the Masters by 1 stroke. That mental fortress, that unshakable belief in himself, even when the entire world doubted, was the foundation of the terror. If you are enjoying this story, use the hype feature and give hype to this video right now. It helps us bring you more content like this. Now let's hear from 7 legends about facing the Golden Bear. Number 7. Nick Faldo grew up idolizing Jack Nicklaus. To Faldo, Nicklaus was the gold standard, the measuring stick by which every golfer judged themselves. As a boy in England, Faldo watched Nicklaus on television, studying his swing, course management, and mental approach. Nicklaus represented everything Faldo wanted to become: the precision, the composure under pressure, the ability to deliver clutch shots when everything was on the line. So when Faldo made the 1977 Ryder Cup team in his first professional year, just 6 years after seriously picking up a club, it felt like a dream. But dreams become nightmares when you must compete against your idol. The Ryder Cup is team golf, but also intensely personal. Match play golf strips away all cushions and safety nets. There is no hiding behind a good back nine to make up for mistakes. You You face your opponent directly, hole after hole, shot for shot. Faldo paired with Peter Oosterhuis against Nicklaus and Ray Floyd in a 4-ball match. For most young players in their first professional year, this would have been completely paralyzing. The logical response would be feeling overwhelmed, playing conservatively, trying not to embarrass yourself. But Faldo did something almost nobody else managed to do in that era. He beat him. Faldo and Oosterhuis won the match 3-1. Not close, not a lucky final hole break. A decisive, dominant victory over the greatest player in the world. For Faldo, it was validation on the highest possible stage. Years later, Faldo would joke about it, saying, just 6 years from picking up a golf club, I beat the great Jack Nicklaus in the Ryder Cup, and I remind Jack of this every time I see him too. That line always gets laughs, but masks a deeper truth. Beating Nicklaus, even once, even in a team format, was such a monumental achievement that it became a defining moment of his entire career. It proved he belonged on the same course, breathing the same competitive air as the greatest player who ever lived. Faldo finished that 1977 Ryder Cup with a perfect individual record. 3 wins, 0 losses, 0 halves. Flawless. But the victory over Nicklaus mattered most to him personally. Ultimate proof of tour credentials. The moment when a young Englishman announced his arrival by toppling the man everyone feared. Yet even in defeat, Nicklaus cast a long shadow. That Faldo still brings it up decades later shows just how incredibly rare such results were. Most players went their entire careers without beating him in a meaningful match. Faldo got one victory to hang his hat on, and it fueled his career, setting the stage for his own dominant run when he would win 6 major championships and establish himself as one of the greatest players of his generation. But even with all that success, even with his own legacy secured, Nicklaus remained the benchmark in Faldo's mind. The terror was not just the possibility of losing, it was knowing that even winning once meant nothing permanent, because Nicklaus would be back tomorrow, and he would remember, and he would hunt you down with that calm precision that made him terrifying. Number 6. Billy Casper won 51 PGA Tour events over the course of his competitive career. 3 major championships, including 2 US Opens and 1 Masters. He captured 5 Vardon trophies for having the lowest scoring average on tour, more than Palmer or Player combined. He set Ryder Cup points records that stood for decades. By every measurable standard, every statistical metric that actually matters in professional golf, Casper was one of the absolute greatest golfers of his generation. He belongs in any serious conversation about elite players from the 1960s. Yet most casual fans today have never even heard his name. Walk up to someone and ask them to name the legends of that era, and they will rattle off the big 3 without hesitation. Nicklaus, Palmer, Player. Those 3 names roll off the tongue automatically. And then the conversation will move on as if those were the only 3 players who mattered, as if nobody else won tournaments or competed at the highest level during that golden age of golf. That is the uniquely cruel terror Jack Nicklaus inflicted on Billy Casper. Not the terror of losing golf tournaments on the scorecard, because Casper actually beat Nicklaus head-to-head in major championships multiple times. In 1966, Billy Casper defeated both Nicklaus and Palmer to win the US Open at Olympic Club in San Francisco. And it was not just any victory. It was one of the most dramatic, improbable comebacks in the entire history of professional golf. Arnold Palmer had a 7-shot lead with just 9 holes remaining to play. The tournament was over in everyone's mind. Palmer was already thinking ahead to the trophy presentation and what he would say in his victory speech. The media members in the press tent were preparing stories about Palmer's dominant performance. And then Billy Casper went to work with a performance that should be legendary. Hole after hole, Casper methodically chipped away at the lead, whilst Palmer started to falter under the pressure and make uncharacteristic mistakes. By the time both players reached the 18th green, the absolutely impossible had happened. The 7-shot lead had completely evaporated, they finished tied and went to an 18-hole playoff the next day. And in that playoff, Casper absolutely dominated from start to finish, shooting 69 to Palmer's 73, claiming the championship in convincing fashion with no drama on the final holes. It was a masterclass in patience and pressure golf, and staying mentally strong when everyone else was panicking, in believing you could win when all logic and probability said you were beaten. But here is where the problem reveals itself. Here is where the terror shows its most insidious form. History does not remember that tournament as Billy Casper's triumph. If you read contemporary articles about the 1966 US Open, if you watch documentaries about that era of golf, the storyline that dominates every single telling is about Arnold Palmer blowing a 7-shot lead. The narrative that lives on in highlight reels and golf retrospectives is exclusively about the King's collapse, Palmer's mistakes, Palmer's missed putts, Palmer's visible disappointment and frustration walking off greens. Billy Casper, the man who actually won the tournament, the man who made all those crucial birdies and holed all those clutch putts under maximum pressure, gets mentioned almost as an afterthought in the story, a footnote to Palmer's failure rather than the protagonist of his own victory. That storyline, the story of the King's dramatic fall from grace, completely swallowed Casper's incredible performance whole and never spit it back out. Billy Casper himself later described what it was like competing in that particular spectacular era, where he had to deliver absolute career best performances week after week just to stay marginally relevant in the public conversation, whilst Jack Nicklaus was busy fundamentally redefining what greatness even meant in professional golf. The Terror Casper experience was not physical. It was not about losing tournaments or failing to execute shots under pressure or choking in big moments. It was existential. It was what the research calls narrative invisibility, the soul-crushing feeling of being systematically erased from history whilst you were still actively writing it with your clubs. The golf world was so completely and utterly captivated by the Big Three, so obsessed with the personal rivalry between Nicklaus and Palmer, so fascinated by Gary Player's global reach and fitness dedication, that even elite champions with 51 career victories like Billy Casper were ruthlessly pushed to the margins of the story everyone wanted to tell. Casper once said that his game was in really good shape in 1966, and he felt ready to play his best golf. He went out and won a major championship, beating the two biggest names in golf in the process, delivering under maximum pressure when it mattered most. And yet, when you read about that US Open now, when you watch old footage or listen to modern retrospectives, the focus is relentlessly and exclusively on Palmer's collapse, not on Casper's brilliant closing stretch or his absolutely dominant playoff performance. It is as if Casper was not even present at the tournament, as if the event simply happened to Palmer, and Casper just passively benefited from being in the right place at the right time, a fortunate recipient of Palmer's misfortune rather than an active champion who earned his victory through skill and mental toughness. That kind of erasure, that complete invisibility despite winning, is a profoundly different kind of defeat than anything that happens on a scorecard. Jack Nicklaus himself, in interviews years later, admitted that seeing Billy Casper's name appear on a leaderboard during a tournament always immediately got his attention and made him sharpen his focus. That is incredibly high praise from a man who rarely acknowledged competitive threats before they had thoroughly proven themselves, who rarely gave other competitors advance credit or recognition. Nicklaus knew exactly how good Casper was at golf. He genuinely respected Casper's game, his exceptional consistency, his brilliant putting touch, his proven ability to close out tournaments when he had the lead on Sunday. But personal respect from your peers does not automatically translate into public visibility or historical recognition. The blinding, overwhelming light of the Nicklaus-Palmer rivalry was so intense, so all-consuming for the media and the public, that even a 51-time winner like Billy Casper could not escape the shadows it cast across the entire sport. And that represents a different kind of absolutely terrifying than losing on the golf course. It is not the competitive defeat that haunts you for the rest of your life. It is winning at the highest level and still being completely forgotten by history. It is knowing deep in your soul that you did absolutely everything right, that you competed at the highest level the sport has ever seen, that you claimed victories and titles and trophies and records, and yet the world simply moved on without really noticing or caring what you accomplished. Casper's career stands as a stark reminder that in the Nicklaus era, pure greatness alone was never enough to secure your rightful place in history. You had to be great and loud, great and charismatic, great and naturally part of the story everyone wanted to tell around the dinner table. Billy Casper was undeniably, statistically great on the golf course week after week, but he was fundamentally quiet and reserved off it. He did not court the media, he did not create drama or controversy, he just showed up and played exceptional golf. And in a world where Jack Nicklaus was actively rewriting the entire definition of dominance, where every single tournament became a referendum on whether Nicklaus would win or who might possibly stop him this week, quiet greatness got systematically airbrushed out of the narrative. The terror Billy Casper experienced was not competitive defeat that shows up on any scorecard. It was being methodically erased from history whilst you were still actively writing it with your golf clubs, winning major championships and setting scoring records, but somehow remaining completely invisible in the story everyone was telling. Number 5. Johnny Miller had a gift for distilling truth into simple sentences. His most famous observation about Nicklaus became the defining summary of that dominance. Miller said, "When Nicklaus plays well, he wins. When he plays badly, he finishes second. When he plays terribly, he finishes third." First hearing that, people laugh. Sounds like a joke, but it was not. It was statistical fact from watching Nicklaus year after year. The terror Miller described was the terror of the floor, the baseline below which Nicklaus refused to fall. In most sports, a bad day means you lose badly. A terrible day means embarrassment. But in the Nicklaus era, a bad day for Jack meant second place in a major. A terrible day meant third. That baseline created a psychological trap for everyone else. You could play the round of your life, execute every shot perfectly, make every putt, and still only finish ahead of Nicklaus if he happened to have an off week. And even then, off for Nicklaus meant third place, which for most players would be a career highlight. Miller lived this reality firsthand during the 1970s, his prime years. He won the 1973 U.S. Open, shooting a final round 63, one of the greatest closing rounds in major history. A performance for the ages, but even then, Miller knew he had been fortunate. Nicklaus had not been at his absolute best. If Nicklaus had been firing on all cylinders, Miller's 63 might have only been good enough for second. That knowledge created constant pressure that wore players down mentally. The numbers back up Miller's axiom in terrifying detail. Between 1962 and 1980, Nicklaus finished top 3 in 41 of the majors contested, a 54% success rate. More than half the time, Nicklaus finished top 3. For context, Tiger Woods finished top 3 in 26 majors over his entire career. Nicklaus did it 46 times total. The gap between Nicklaus and everyone else is not just in victories, it is in relentless, suffocating consistency. Miller noted that even on Nicklaus's worst days, the rest of the field felt they were competing for runner-up. That is the essence of terror. Not that Nicklaus always won, that he never lost badly, never collapsed, never disappeared. If you wanted to beat Jack Nicklaus in a major, you had to play better than him for 72 holes, not just outplay him Sunday or get hot for one round. You had to sustain excellence across 4 days, in all conditions, under maximum pressure, and almost nobody could do that. The floor was too high, margin for error too thin, one bad round, one shaky 9 holes, one stretch where you lost focus, and Nicklaus would pass you and never look back. Johnny Miller gave us the words to describe this, but every player who competed against him felt it in their bones. The terror of knowing your absolute best might only be good enough for second. Number 4. Lee Trevino talked nonstop. On the course, off the course, practice rounds, majors, it did not matter. Trevino had a joke for every occasion. For years, people assumed that was just his personality, but the truth was more calculated. Trevino's constant talking was his survival mechanism against competing with Nicklaus. Trevino recognized early that Nicklaus's concentration was an iron force, so intense it could stifle an opponent's rhythm and drain confidence. So Trevino built a defense. If he could not break Nicklaus's focus, he could at least protect his own by filling silence with noise. The most famous example came at the 1971 U.S. Open playoff at Merion. As both stood on the first tee, Trevino reached into his bag and pulled out a rubber snake, then tossed it at Nicklaus. The gallery erupted in laughter. Many assumed Trevino was trying to rattle Nicklaus, but both later clarified the truth. Trevino was not trying to unnerve Nicklaus. He was trying to loosen himself up. Trevino admitted he needed all the help he could get to beat the man he considered the greatest. That humility buried beneath the jokes reveals the real terror. Even a player as talented as Trevino, who would win 6 majors, felt he needed psychological tricks just to stay level. Trevino famously joked that when Nicklaus was in the field, he was only playing for second place, a self-deprecating line that got big laughs, but also rooted in statistical reality. And here is where it gets interesting. Trevino beat Nicklaus head-to-head in 4 majors. In 1968 at Oak Hill, Trevino first, Nicklaus second. In 1971 at Merion, same result. In 1972 at Muirfield, Trevino again edged Nicklaus. In 1974 at Tanglewood, same. 4 of Trevino's 6 major victories came with Nicklaus as runner-up. That makes Trevino one of the few who could claim to have a Nicklaus's number. Yet even with that record, Trevino maintained that you gotta be lucky to beat Jack Nicklaus because he's the greatest golfer to ever hold a club. Trevino shared that Nicklaus once told him he was a lot better than I thought I was. That compliment from the man Trevino spent years trying to match meant everything. Validation from the one person whose opinion mattered most. But it also underscored the psychological dynamic. Even in victory, Trevino was seeking approval from Nicklaus, measuring himself against the standard Nicklaus set. The terror was not in losses. It was knowing that even when you won, you had only just survived. And Nicklaus would be back tomorrow, calm and unbothered, ready to hunt again. Number 3. The 1977 Open Championship at Turnberry is remembered as the Duel in the Sun, one of the greatest head-to-head battles in golf history. For the final 2 rounds, Nicklaus and Tom Watson were paired together, turning a major into a private match play war. The rest of the field became irrelevant. The tournament stopped being about lowest score and became a pure test of wills between the legend and the rising star. And the scores they posted were almost inhuman. Both shot 65 in the 3rd round. Both shot 65 in the final round. In conditions that destroyed everyone else, Nicklaus and Watson played like they were on a different planet. When it was over, Watson won at 268, 12 under par. Nicklaus finished 1 shot back at 269, and 3rd place, Hubert Green, finished at 279, 10 full strokes behind Nicklaus. That 10-stroke gap between 2nd and 3rd is the clearest illustration of the Nicklaus effect. He did not just compete, he dragged his primary rival into a stratosphere of performance no one else could touch. Watson was forced to play the best golf of his life just to survive, and even then, it came down to the final hole. At the 18th, Nicklaus drove into the gorse, thick rough that should have meant bogey and the end of his chances. Tournament should have been over, but Nicklaus did what he always did. He saved a birdie from the gorse On the 72nd hole of a major, that miraculous recovery forced Watson to hole a 3-foot putt just to win. One slip, one moment of doubt, and Watson would have lost despite playing two of the best rounds ever seen. Watson later said that Jack Nicklaus was the man you had to beat to be the best. Not enough to play well, not enough to shoot low scores. You had to beat Nicklaus specifically because he was the measuring stick, the standard, the benchmark. Watson also noted that no one ever competed harder than Nicklaus. No one ever wanted to win more than Nicklaus. That relentless competitiveness, that refusal to concede even when the odds were mathematically thin, was the source of terror. Even when Nicklaus was in trouble, even when the tournament seemed decided, he found a way to claw back, to make one more birdie, to force you to execute under maximum pressure. And if you faltered for even a second, he would take everything. Watson did not falter. He made the putt. He won the duel in the sun. But the cost was exhaustion. Watson walked off the course completely drained from the mental effort of staying focused for 36 holes whilst playing against a man who refused to go away. And the truly terrifying part was knowing Nicklaus would be back next week and at the next major. He would be there demanding that same level of perfection every time. One moment of weakness and he would run you down without mercy. Number 2. The 1962 U.S. Open at Oakmont was the moment the golf world realized a fundamental shift had occurred. Arnold Palmer was the undisputed king, beloved by millions, a charismatic force who had turned golf into a television spectacle. Palmer's aggressive style, his emotional approach, his habit of hitching his pants and going for broke on risky shots had captured sports fans who had never cared about golf before. He made it exciting. He made it dramatic. And in 1962, he was at the peak of his powers. Oakmont was essentially Palmer's backyard, located miles from his hometown of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The gallery was packed with Palmer supporters. They called themselves Arnie's Army, and they were fiercely loyal. Every Palmer birdie was greeted with roars. Every Palmer putt was met with held breath and erupting cheers, and every mistake by Palmer's competitors was met with jeers. The primary target was a 22-year-old rookie named Jack Nicklaus, the chubby kid from Ohio who dared to challenge their king on his home turf. The crowd did not just root against Nicklaus. They actively tried to break him. They shouted Fat Jack. They hurled insults. They wanted him to fail, to collapse, to let Palmer claim the victory everyone assumed was his. But Nicklaus did not flinch. He did not react. He did not let the hostile crowd penetrate his concentration even slightly. Nicklaus later recalled he had blinders on during that week, focusing entirely on the mechanics of his swing and the demands of the course. The crowd noise was irrelevant. The pressure was irrelevant. All that mattered was execution, one shot at a time. The tournament came down to an 18-hole playoff. Palmer versus Nicklaus, king versus challenger, in front of a gallery desperate to see Palmer win. And the statistical breakdown reveals exactly why Nicklaus was about to become the most terrifying player in golf history. Over 90 total holes including the playoff, Nicklaus had 1 3-putt. Palmer had 10. That precision on the greens, that clinical control under pressure, was the fundamental difference. In the playoff, Nicklaus shot 71. Palmer shot 74. Nicklaus won by 3 strokes, and everything changed. The balance of power shifted forever. Palmer himself acknowledged the shift immediately. After the playoff, Palmer made a statement to the press that has become famous. He said, "Now that the big guy is out of the cage, everybody better run for cover." An admission, a public recognition that something fundamental had changed. Palmer also praised Nicklaus's ability to hit long irons, specifically the 1-iron and 2-iron, higher and with more control than anyone else in history. That physical advantage, combined with the mental indestructibility Nicklaus had displayed by staying calm in a hostile environment, created a player who seemed unbeatable. But for Palmer personally, the loss was more than a professional defeat. It was a psychological wound that never fully healed. Palmer later confessed that the realization he should have made a 4 instead of a 6 at a decisive moment lived with me all my life, and still does. Decades later, Palmer was still haunted by that one hole, that one mistake. That internal haunting speaks to the specific type of terror Nicklaus inflicted, the terror of self-doubt. By consistently performing at a level that forced rivals to execute career-best shots just to remain competitive, Nicklaus created a state of high-stress performance that often led to mistakes. And those mistakes lived with his opponents forever. Palmer called Nicklaus a great player with a knack for playing golf very, very well. Simple praise, almost understated. But coming from Arnold Palmer, the man whose throne Nicklaus had just claimed, in front of Palmer's own fans on Palmer's home course, those words carried enormous weight. Palmer knew what the rest of the golf world was about to learn. The era of the king was over. The era of the golden bear had begun, and the terror was only getting started. Palmer's famous quote actually was longer, saying just the fact that he was so good. He was a great player, and he had a knack for playing the game of golf and played it very, very well. High praise from a dethroned king. Number 1. In 1986, Jack Nicklaus was 46 years old, an age when most golfers have retired. He had not won a major in 6 years. The media wrote him off as washed up. a relic who should gracefully step aside for younger stars. His peers shared that assessment. The narrative was not about competition, it was about legacy and retirement. But Gary Player, one of the few men to win a career Grand Slam and one of Nicklaus's fiercest rivals, saw something different. Player believed that Nicklaus possessed the greatest mind in the history of golf, a mental capacity that transcended physical ability. And in April 1986, that mind proved Player right in the most dramatic fashion. When people doubted Nicklaus, when the world told him his time was over, Nicklaus had a simple internal response he shared with Player. "I know I can." Those 4 words were not hope or wishful thinking. They were fact, rooted in decades of high-stakes execution and unshakable belief. Player witnessed this mindset and found it both terrifying and awe-inspiring. At the 1986 Masters, Nicklaus was not supposed to contend. He was not even supposed to be a factor. But in the final round on Sunday, something extraordinary happened. Nicklaus played a front 9 that was respectable but not exceptional, shooting 35, 1 under. Then on the back 9 at Augusta, with the golf world watching, Nicklaus turned back the clock. He posted a back 930, 6 under par on the most pressure-packed 9 holes in golf. A charge that left younger stars like Greg Norman, Seve Ballesteros, and Tom Kite scrambling to keep up. When the final round was over, Nicklaus had shot 65 and won the Masters by 1 stroke. At 46, in an era when golfers were supposed to decline rapidly after 40, Nicklaus had claimed his 6th green jacket, his 18th major, ultimate proof that the mind can overcome the body. Player later said that if circumstances had been different throughout Nicklaus's career, he could have won 20 or more majors instead of 18. That assertion reflects Player's belief that Nicklaus's mental capacity was the true differentiator between a great player and a legendary one. The 1986 Masters was ultimate validation. It showed that the terror of Nicklaus was never just about physical skill or driving distance or putting touch. It was about the mind, the refusal to accept limitations, the ability to shut out doubt and criticism, and execute under the highest pressure. Player saw that mind up close for decades, competing against it, respecting it, fearing it. And in 1986, when the world had moved on, that mind reminded everyone why Jack Nicklaus was, and always would be, the standard. So what was the terror of Jack Nicklaus really about? When you step back and look at all these stories together, when you listen carefully to what all these legends are actually saying about competing against him for decades, a remarkably clear and consistent picture emerges. The terror was absolutely not cruelty or meanness. Nicklaus never taunted his opponents on the course, never celebrated publicly when they missed critical putts or hit bad shots in pressure moments, never played psychological mind games or tried to intimidate anyone with words or threatening gestures off the golf course. If anything, Nicklaus was unfailingly polite, respectful, and gracious to his competitors in every interaction. The terror was purely, exclusively performance-based, built on what the research documents call the strategic architecture of fear. That architecture rested firmly on 3 absolutely unshakable foundations that defined his entire career. First, concentration. Arnold Palmer once defined concentration in the simplest possible terms as focusing totally and completely on the business at hand, blocking out absolutely everything else that does not directly contribute to executing the specific shot in front of you. Jack Nicklaus embodied that definition more completely and consistently than any other player in the entire history of professional golf. Whether he was facing a viciously hostile crowd of 30,000 rabid Palmer fans at Oakmont Country Club who were actively trying to break his focus, or dealing with the relentlessly mounting pressure of the duel in the sun at Turnberry, where one mistake would cost him the championship, Nicklaus maintained an absolutely iron focus that created an impenetrable psychological barrier that very few opponents could match or penetrate. This legendary concentration was what Lee Trevino desperately tried to break with constant humor and rubber snake pranks. It was what Tom Watson tried to match through absolutely sheer force of will and determination, and it was what ultimately broke down and defeated most of Nicklaus's opponents over the long competitive arc of time. Second, consistency. Johnny Miller's famous axiom about Nicklaus was absolutely not a joke or comedic exaggeration designed to get laughs. It was a brutally accurate reflection of cold statistical data accumulated over decades of major championship golf. Nicklaus's terrible days, his absolute worst performances in major championships when nothing was working right, resulted in third-place finishes that would be career highlights for most players. His baseline level of performance, his floor, was demonstrably higher than most other players' absolute peaks and career best rounds, and that created an absolutely suffocating sense of inevitability for everyone competing against him week after week. You had to play virtually perfect golf for 4 complete days, 72 holes without a significant mistake, just to have any realistic chance of beating him. One bad round, one shaky 9-hole stretch, one brief period where you lost focus or confidence, and you were completely done. Nicklaus would methodically pass you on the leaderboard and never ever look back. Third, inevitability. There was no secret trick to beating Jack Nicklaus. No hidden strategy or magical tactical approach that would give you some kind of advantage or edge. No psychological weakness you could exploit. You simply had to go out and play demonstrably better golf than him over 72 complete holes of a major championship. And for an entire quarter century, spanning from 1962, when he turned professional, all the way to 1986, when he won that final Masters, almost nobody in the world could do that with any kind of consistency. The terror was knowing with absolute certainty that Nicklaus would always, without exception, be there on Sunday afternoon in the final round, calm and completely unbothered by pressure, patiently waiting for you to inevitably make that one crucial mistake under pressure. And when you finally did make that mistake, because all human beings eventually do, when the pressure becomes unbearable, he would take absolutely everything from you without the slightest hesitation or mercy. But here's the truly remarkable and often overlooked part of the entire Jack Nicklaus story that deserves much more attention. The terror was simultaneously also profound inspiration for everyone who competed against him. Nicklaus absolutely did not drag professional golf down to some ugly, defensive, boring style of play that killed excitement. He lifted the entire sport up to heights it had never previously reached in its long history. He forced his rivals and competitors to play at performance levels they genuinely did not know they were actually capable of reaching. Tom Watson's legendary performance in the duel in the sun at Turnberry, shooting those back-to-back rounds of 65 in brutal conditions, happened specifically because Nicklaus was right there beside him, pushing him to that superhuman level. Lee Trevino's 6 major championship victories, several of which were won in direct head-to-head competition against Nicklaus, with Nicklaus finishing as runner-up, meant infinitely more and carried far greater weight because of exactly who he was beating to claim those titles. Even Gary Player's incredible career Grand Slam achievement and his remarkable longevity competing at the highest level into his 40s were significantly elevated because they all happened directly in the shadow of Nicklaus, measured constantly against the impossible standard Nicklaus had established. Nicklaus did not just win golf tournaments and collect trophies, he fundamentally restructured the entire psychological expectations of what a professional golfer could possibly achieve at the highest level. He moved the sport decisively from the era of the charismatic hero, perfectly exemplified by Arnold Palmer's highly emotional and aggressive approach to every shot, to the era of the clinical professional where mental discipline and absolutely consistent execution mattered far more than natural flair or crowd-pleasing personality. He showed an entire generation of professional golfers that true greatness was not remotely about how you looked on camera or how enthusiastically the crowd responded to your style. It was exclusively about execution, meticulous preparation, unshakable mental toughness, and cultivating an absolutely unbreakable mind that categorically refused to accept defeat under any circumstances, and that demanding standard remains the ultimate benchmark in professional golf even today, decades after his final victory. When people debate who the greatest golfer of all time is today, regardless of generation or era, the conversation always, without exception, starts with Jack Nicklaus and his legendary career. 18 major championships, 19 runner-up finishes, 9 third-place finishes, 73 top 10 finishes in majors. The numbers are almost incomprehensible when you see them all together, but the real legacy is not captured in numbers alone. It is captured in the universal conclusion reached by every single player who competed against him. Palmer to Watson, to Trevino, to Faldo, they all walked away with the same profound understanding. Jack Nicklaus was the man you had to beat to be considered the best, and beating him required you to become the absolute best version of yourself, to access levels of performance you did not know you were capable of reaching. That is not terror in any negative sense. That is pure greatness. That is what it means to set a standard so impossibly high that everyone else has to fundamentally elevate their entire game just to compete. That is the lasting legacy of the Golden Bear. If you truly enjoyed this comprehensive deep dive into one of the greatest and most terrifyingly dominant competitive athletes of all time, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting us know which sports legend you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
You had the best speed of any player he's ever played with when it came to your putting. And he described how you would slice putts, you would hook putts, you would putt him off the toe. And this all speaks to just the creative and the feel that you have to be a good putter, and especially for Augusta National.
They called Ben Crenshaw the greatest putter ever, and if you stood on the same green as him, if you were one of the players who had to watch that ball roll toward the hole from places it had absolutely no business going in, you did not feel inspired. You felt something else. You felt the slow, creeping, gut-sinking realization that no matter what you did that day, no matter how perfect your ball striking was or how steady your nerves were, this one quiet man with his old beat-up putter was going to take something from you, something you could not get back. He did not shout. He did not pump his fist after every make. He just walked up to the ball, looked at the line, and stroked it. And it went in. It always seemed to go in. Not sometimes. Not on the big moments. Always. And that was the terrifying part. How does a calm, easygoing man from Austin, Texas, nicknamed Gentle Ben, become the most feared putter in the history of professional golf? How does a player so quiet, so unhurried, so completely without ego on the green, end up being the one name that made other tour pros feel helpless just by showing up on the same course? That is what this video is about. And once you hear what the legends of this game actually said about him, you will understand exactly why that word, terrifying, is the only one that fits. Also, if this story is already pulling you in, tap the hype feature and give this video some hype right now. It helps other golf fans find stories like this one. Now let us get into it. Picture Masters Week, not 1984, not 1995, a recent one. Smiley Kaufman, a PGA Tour winner and one of the sharpest minds covering the game today, sat down with Ben Crenshaw for a conversation during tournament week at Augusta. And almost immediately, Kaufman said what so many in the golf world already feel, but rarely say out loud this plainly. He looked at Ben and told him that one of the very first things he thinks about with his game is how great he was with the putter. Just like that. No warm-up, no easing into it, no tiptoeing around the subject. Because when you think of Ben Crenshaw, the putter is where your mind goes first, at every time. It is not the wins, though there were plenty. It is not the swing, though it was beautiful. It is the pudding. It is always the pudding. Kaufman also brought up what Justin Leonard had said about Ben. Leonard, a major champion himself, had called Ben's speed control the best any player had ever seen. Speed control is everything in putting. It is the difference between a ball that lips out and a ball that falls. A ball arriving too fast has almost no room for error. A ball that dies right at the hole can fall from any angle, left, right, or center. Ben Crenshaw made the hole bigger for himself than it was for everyone else on tour. He did it through feel and instinct that took a lifetime to develop. That is what Kaufman was pointing to. And the fact that a modern broadcaster sitting with a legend still marvels at it after all these years tells you the legend has not faded. It has only grown. Now let us understand where all of this came from. Ben grew up in Austin, Texas, and his putting teacher was Harvey Penick. Penick was not the kind of teacher who broke things into angles and numbers. He did not talk about shoulder tilt or face angle at impact or any of the mechanics that were starting to take over golf instruction at the time. He believed in fingers and feel. He believed the putter should be an extension of your nervous system, not a tool you controlled with your big muscles. He believed the best putters were born with instinct and that a teacher's job was to protect that instinct, not replace it with a system. So that is what he did for Ben. He protected it, nurtured it, gave it room to grow into something the game had never quite seen before. Some players learn putting like math. Ben learned it like music. That difference is what made him nearly impossible to figure out and nearly impossible to beat. Ben also had a weapon. He used the same putter for almost his entire career. A Wilson 8802, received as a gift when he turned 15. He called it Little Ben. The 8802 is a heel-shafted blade with significant toe flow and no offset. For most players, it is notoriously difficult to use. It has a very small sweet spot, and any shot hit even slightly off-center tells you immediately. But that is exactly why Ben loved it. That feedback ran straight through the shaft and into his hands on every single stroke. And because his feel was so refined, that information made him sharper, not confused. It let him control the speed of every putt the way a musician controls volume. Soft when soft was needed, firm when the moment called for firmness. Always dialed in, always exactly right. Now let us count down the legends who explained, in their own words, just how terrifying Ben Crenshaw really was. We are going in reverse order, saving the most powerful voice for last. Number 9 is Jim Nelford. Nelford was behind the microphone at the 1995 Masters, calling the action live when Crenshaw walked up the 18th fairway, and the weight of everything that week came rushing to the surface all at once. What Nelford said in that moment has stayed with people ever since. He described the scene. So many people. So silent. Ben Crenshaw winning the Masters for a second time. Holding back the emotion all week. Keeping it checked until that very last moment on that very last green. And then Nelford said that there was no greater tribute to the man Ben loved, Harvey Penick, than that picture right there. That the picture spoke for itself. Those are not the words of a broadcaster reading from a script. Those are the words of a man who understood what he was watching and knew it was bigger than a golf tournament. The fact that Nelford, a former tour pro himself, was so moved tells you everything about the size of what Ben did that week. Number 8 is Greg Norman. Norman was the world number 1 at the time. He was powerful and aggressive and used to bending tournaments to his will. He built his career on taking over golf courses with length. He was not beaten by a smarter game plan. He was beaten by something he could not see, touch, or prepare for. That is the Crenshaw terror in its purest form. The world number 1 walking away speechless. Number 7 is Davis Love III. Love finished just one stroke behind Crenshaw at that 1995 Masters. One shot. And he has spoken about that week many times since, always with a kind of wonder in his voice. Love said that there was always a little magic around Ben, that he was driven and charged and obviously one of the greatest putters ever. Driven and charged? Think about those words in context. Ben had just buried his mentor days before the tournament began. He came to Augusta carrying grief that would have broken most competitors before they even teed it up. And yet the grief did not slow him down. It seemed to lift him. Love felt it. Norman felt it. The entire field felt it. And not one of them could match it. Number 6 is David Feherty. Feherty is one of the most honest and vivid voices the game has ever produced. When he talks about a player, he does not reach for safe or polished language. He reaches for the truth. He has competed against the best in the world on both the European Tour and the PGA Tour, so when he describes what it felt like to watch someone putt, he is speaking from experience that most people simply do not have. So when Feherty described watching Ben Crenshaw on the greens, what he said carried real weight. He said it was like watching a man possessed. He described the stroke as silky and precise in a way that made other professionals feel helpless. Helpless. Not frustrated. Not challenged. Helpless. Because the ability Ben had did not come from something you could study or copy or counter with extra practice. It lived in his fingers and his instincts and a lifetime of feel. When Ben walked onto a green, Feherty said, the atmosphere changed. There was a quiet intimidation that had nothing to do with swagger or aggression. It was the intimidation of a man who simply knew something other players did not. Feherty called it almost supernatural. He was not being dramatic, he was being accurate. Number 5 is Tom Watson. Watson is one of the greatest to ever play this game. 8 major championships, a legendary competitor and a legendary putter in his own right. When Watson speaks about putting, every serious golfer listens. Watson was right there in the final round of the 1984 Masters, locked in a battle with Crenshaw for the green jacket. On the 10th hole, something happened that Watson never forgot. The 10th at Augusta is a long, punishing par 4 that drops steeply downhill to a green, tilting hard from right to left. Crenshaw had a long, difficult putt. The wise play was to lag it close and take the par. Instead, Ben holed it, confident, unhurried, like he had already watched it go in before he ever pulled the putter back. Watson stood there and called it an omen. Not a great shot, not a momentum shift, an omen, something foretelling what was coming. Watson later reflected that Crenshaw and one other player were the 2 best putters of their entire generation, and that putting is all in the fingers and all in the feel. For Watson to say that a man who had made clutch putts on the biggest stages in the world tells you that what he saw from Ben that day was in a category he rarely encountered. Number 4 is Tiger Woods. In a conversation with his longtime coach Butch Harmon, Tiger Woods said something that stopped people cold. He admitted that when he was in college and during his first couple of years on the PGA Tour, he was actively trying to putt like Ben Crenshaw. Tiger Woods, the man most considered the greatest golfer who ever lived, the most clutch putter in the history of the sport, was watching Ben Crenshaw and trying to copy him. Harmon added that other tour pros would gather on the practice green to watch Ben, not to steal the technique because it was too personal and too individual to replicate, but simply to observe, to be near something they could only admire. When the greatest player the game has ever seen looks at you as a benchmark, the conversation about the greatest putter is effectively over. Number 3 is Tom Kite. Kite's connection to Ben goes deeper than any other name on this list. They grew up together, they trained under the same teacher, they competed side by side at the University of Texas, and then for decades on tour. Kite watched Ben Crenshaw putt from the very beginning, through the development, through the early wins, through the majors and the near misses and the masterpieces. And in his Hall of Fame induction speech, Kite said that the best putters he had ever been around in his entire life were his own family and his friend Ben. His family, that is not a quote you throw out lightly. He talked about how you could stand next to Ben on the practice green, watch every single detail of what he was doing, and still walk away unable to teach it to anyone else. Other elite putters, men who had given their careers to mastering this craft, stood on the sideline and watched Ben and knew they were in the presence of something that simply could not be taught. Roberts understood the craft better than almost anyone alive, and even he stood in awe. Number 1 is Brad Faxon. Faxon is ranked among the greatest putters in the history of the game. Full stop. He has spent his entire professional life studying, practicing, and thinking about putting more deeply than almost anyone. His opinion on the subject carries more weight than nearly any voice in golf. And in a conversation with Scotty Cameron, Faxon said it plainly and without any hesitation at all. Ben Crenshaw is the greatest putter who ever lived, not among the greatest. the greatest. Faxon explained that Ben's feel and touch existed in a category that no mechanical instruction could ever reach or replicate. He pointed out that Ben let his head and his knees move naturally through the stroke, things that modern coaches would flag immediately as flaws, but which were actually the hidden source of his rhythmic, flowing, utterly consistent genius. Faxon had competed at the highest level for decades. He had watched every great putter of his era up close, and his conclusion was not complicated. Ben Crenshaw stood alone. Now let us go back to 1995 one final time, because it deserves it and it always will. Harvey Penick passed away just days before the Masters began that year. Ben served as a pallbearer on a Wednesday. He stood at the graveside of the man who had shaped him as a golfer and as a person. And then he drove to Augusta, and he played golf. Over 72 holes on the fastest and most demanding greens in professional golf, Ben Crenshaw did not three-putt a single time. Zero, not once. At Augusta National, where the greens run at speeds that can reach 13 or 14 on the Stimpmeter, going the entire tournament without a three-putt is something almost no one does under normal circumstances. Doing it while carrying grief, while honoring a man he loved, while the whole world watched and waited, is something that defies ordinary explanation. It sits in a place beyond statistics. Ben said later that it felt like Harvey had given him a 15th club that week, an invisible one, the most powerful one in the bag. And when you look at the numbers, when you understand what 0-3 putts for 72 holes at Augusta actually means, you start to believe him. That is why Ben Crenshaw was terrifying. Not because he was loud, not because he was aggressive or physically dominant. He was none of those things. He was terrifying because of certainty. Quiet, complete, unshakable certainty. The kind built over a lifetime under one of the wisest teachers the game has known. The kind that meant no lead was safe, no distance was too great, no slope was too difficult. He would hole a long birdie early and let you know his feel was fully dialed in for the day. Then he would miss a green and convert a nasty 15-footer for par, taking the momentum right out of your hands before you even realized what was happening. By the time the back nine arrived, opponents would start pressing. They would take risks they did not need to take. They would aim at pins they should have avoided, not because the course forced them to, but because somewhere deep in their chest they already knew. The ball was going in. It had been going in all day. It was always going in, and they could not stop it, could not slow it down, and could not find an answer for it no matter how well they played their own game. That is the legacy of Gentle Ben. Not just 2 green jackets, not just a beautiful stroke, but a full generation of the best players in the world. Players who had seen everything, competed against everyone, and thought they had prepared for any scenario the game could throw at them. Who stood on those greens, watched him putt, and felt something quiet and cold move through them. Something they had never felt against any other player in their entire careers. Because they knew, with a terrifying and complete clarity, that no matter what they did, they were watching something they could not stop. If you love this one, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment down below and tell us your favorite Ben Crenshaw memory or the putt that stays with you the most. We read every single one, and we appreciate every comment more than you know. Ben Crenshaw deserved every single word of this one. We hope you felt every bit of that too.